The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at choi.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Laura McKenzie. Electoral reform is once again an issue in the House of Commons. Back in the summer, NDP MP for Nanaimo-Ladysmith Lisa Marie Barron put forward a motion for the creation of a National Citizens' Assembly on electoral reform. If created, this assembly would recommend alternatives to our current first-past-the-post system. This comes after the Liberal government's 2015 campaign promise for electoral reform, which ultimately was abandoned in February 2017. The Liberal government cited a lack of support for reform. In British Columbia, electoral reform has been on the table several times. A 2018 referendum saw 61% of voters electing to stay with the first-past-the-post system. Critics described the referendum questions as confusing. An exit polling conducted by Research Co. found that the number one reason for those who didn't vote was not feeling informed enough. Turnout for the referendum was a low 42%. Last week on November 7th, MP Lisa Marie Barron's motion was debated in the House of Commons. This week, Barron joins me in studio to talk about her motion and why she believes we need to change our electoral system on a federal level. I also speak with VIU Professor of Political Studies Michael McKenzie about our current electoral system and what could happen if the motion carries following further debate in February 2024. Finally, I speak with Gisela Ruckert from Fair Vote Canada about the need for electoral reform. With that, let's jump into it. Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. Currently, your motion for a National Citizens' Assembly on electoral reform is being debated in the House of Commons. Can you explain to us why you made this motion and why you and others in support believe there is a need for a change from our current first-past-the-post system?
Absolutely. Hi, Lauren. I'm so happy to be here. So yes, absolutely. You're correct. I was so proud to be able to bring forward a motion calling for a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. It came forward for debate for all members of Parliament from all parties to be able to have some good debate and discussion around why this motion is important. And ultimately, the reason why I decided to bring forward this motion for debate is because of what we're seeing all around us. So we're currently experiencing the impacts of a climate crisis. We know we live in Nanaimo and we're seeing firsthand the impacts of forest fires and the heat dome that recently hit us, droughts, and the impacts are just tremendous on us and we require action. There's so many people that are struggling to make ends meet, to keep food on the table, to keep a roof over their head. We're in a toxic substance crisis. We know that we are in troubling times. And it is time for us to have solutions in place that will provide us with what is required to be able to come together and move forward in the timely manner required. And so just for some context, currently what we have in place is called a first-past-the-post system. So this was implemented in 1867 with Confederation, and I'm certain you can agree with me that a lot has changed since 1867. And so what I'm calling for is a National Citizens Assembly where Canadians can come together, be provided with expert information, and for those solutions and recommendations to be given to government to be able to move forward in the best direction, looking at how our votes can best be counted, to look at the way that we vote, looking at the voting age. There's so many aspects of electoral reform that need to be looked at to make sure that our democracy is as strong as possible.
What is the problem with first-past-the-post? Yeah,
so the first-past-the-post system is not only outdated, but it results in what we're seeing around us. So I'm a newly elected, although I'm not sure how much longer I can say newly elected. I was elected in 2021 as a member of Parliament. And currently we have only 30% women as just one example. Now, 30% women sounds like a lot, but I can tell you firsthand, it doesn't feel like a lot. It's definitely an underrepresentation. And we know that women account for actually just over 50% of the general population. We also know that we have an underrepresentation of Indigenous people, Black, people who are BIPOC, people living with disabilities, people living with low incomes. The point is that currently our Parliament does not represent our communities. And what that means is we have many voices who are missing at the table, essential voices that should be part of the decision-making process. The other problem that, amongst others, is that it encourages divisive politics. We're seeing this more and more, divisive political games being played in the House, which is really not moving us in the direction that we need to see to have the sound solutions put into place for people. Constituents are electing representatives to go into the House of Commons, to be their voice in Parliament, and to push for solutions being put into place that meet those needs. But instead, we're seeing these political games that are being played. They're super frustrating and not serving anybody, not any of those who elected those people anyways, who elected the representatives, I should say.
Have you received any support from other members from different parties?
Great question. So some history here. The NDP has been pushing for electoral reform for a long, long time now, far before I became member of Parliament. But not only the NDP, the Green Party has also been pushing for this. The Liberals have made lots of promises around this. And so coming in as member of Parliament elected in 2021, it became very obvious to me that we need to be working together in order to move forward on solutions such as electoral reform. And so my colleague Daniel Blake, he's NDP. He is the MP for Elmwood-Transcona in Manitoba, and he put forward a lot of work. He had members from all parties in what's called a parliamentary committee agree to moving forward with a study on electoral reform. Unfortunately, the Liberals called an election, and so that study no longer was able to move forward. But since then, in 2021, since being elected, my colleague, the MP for Kitchener Centre, Mike Morris, who's a Green MP, put forward a motion actually that's very, very similar to the one that I put forward, calling for a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. And so when I found out that I was going to have the opportunity to bring forward a motion for debate, it was, quite frankly, a no-brainer for me to carry on this baton of work and carry on what my colleagues had started and finally have the Liberals, finally have all parties and members of Parliament called to the floor to provide their opinions publicly so that all Canadians can hear, and to finally have a vote on the topic to find out if we will have members moving together in the direction that Canadians are asking for.
Have you received any pushback?
Yes, absolutely. So I should provide some information around how the debate went in the House of Commons. So as expected, of course, the Green Party, because they're not what's called an official party within the House of Commons, they weren't able to do a speech, but I know that they are very much in support. The Liberal who stood up and did a speech did not speak in support of the motion, which is interesting because at the most recent convention that the Liberals put on, the members called for a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. So I did ask him to check with his membership and see what they are asking from him. The Bloc Québécois spoke in support, and the Conservative who stood and did a speech on that day spoke against. And so there is a mix that's happening. I will tell you, though, that I have spoken to some Conservatives who are very much in support of this motion moving forward. And so between now and this, what's called the second hour of debate, will be coming up early February. So what will happen in early February, there'll be more speeches, more debate. And then about a week approximately after that, a week, 2 weeks, depends on the timing, we'll see this come to a vote. And so between now and then, my hope is that we will see Canadians from across the country sharing information with their members of Parliament, explaining why this is important, explaining why they would like to see a move in this direction so that we can all come together come the day that we vote on this and move together. Because there are absolutely, to answer your question, people who have some concerns. That's all part of the conversation that we have together, and why I'm calling for a National Citizens Assembly so that they can dig into the issues and identify the best path forward.
Provincially, we have seen several governments, BC, Ontario, PEI, put electoral reform to referendum, but every time it's gone to a vote, it failed. Recently, in 2018, in this province, 61% of voters voted to keep the current system, though this referendum saw a smaller turnout than compared to general elections. Do you think it could be different federally?
My motion, just to clarify, does not call for a referendum. And when you look at the basis and the reason why I'm not calling for a referendum is actually when you look around the world, you'll find many, many countries use a proportional representation system. So just to name a few, Norway, New Zealand, Switzerland, Scotland, and Germany all use a proportional representation system. And when we actually look at the list of the countries that use a proportional representation system, only 2 of them went to referendum. The remainder of them followed a very similar process to a National Citizens Assembly. I have some concerns about us going forward with a referendum. We do notice that often partisanship is brought back into play with a referendum. And of course, there were some issues with the previous referendums that we've seen. To be frank, it was a little bit complicated. People tend to stick with the status quo when it's too confusing. And the other thing is that the threshold was very high of the amount of votes that were required for it to pass. And so there were some issues. Ultimately, my hope is that we'll see a National Citizens Assembly come together and that those recommendations will go to government. But I can't reiterate enough that the Liberal government can move forward with this today. This motion, the government can take it, the Liberal government, and say, this is important. This is something we promised. This is what Canadians are asking for. And we will be moving forward with the steps required to see electoral reform happening and to see our democracy strengthened. And so ultimately that is the goal. One other thing I wanted to mention, Lauren, sorry, I'm very excited about this topic. But one other thing I wanted to mention is that actually when you look across the world at countries that have a proportional representation system, we also see a decrease in income inequality. We see an increase in successful climate action solutions that are being put forward. And when we look at the UN Development Index, which focuses on health, the standard of living is just two examples, we also see higher scores on that. So that's just a glimmer of what can be possible when we look at strengthening our democracy and making sure that voices are represented and that we have a government where people need to come together rather than continue to play political games to move things forward.
What are the next steps?
The next steps. So as I mentioned before, just encouraging everybody to reach out. I'm so happy to always get feedback from members in the community, whether there's questions, whether there's positive feedback, whether there's negative feedback. I want to hear it all because this is exactly what my hope was, that we would have some really good discussions around how to strengthen our democracy. But across the country, I'm hoping that people will be in touch with their members of parliament. If everybody could tell their friends, tell their family, get this discussion going and make sure that the members of parliament are aware that this is important to them. I'm hearing from other MPs across the country that they are hearing from their constituents about this motion, and they will bring it up to me as a result, and we'll have that really good discussion. And I've had some support as a result of constituents reaching out. So constituents, ultimately, people in our communities are the drivers of this work. And my hope is that we can get this pressure going to have the Liberals finally follow through with their promises and to see a change from the ongoing divisive partisan games that we are seeing in the chamber.
Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Lauren.
That was Nanaimo-Ladysmith MP Lisa Marie Barron.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHOI's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at choi.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support.
I had the chance to speak with VIU Political Studies professor Michael McKenzie about our current voting system and what to expect with a National Citizens Assembly. For listeners who might not know, can you give a brief description of how the current system works?
So the first past the post system is a electoral system where we elect members of parliament, in this case, to represent specific districts or constituencies. And these are relatively small geographic areas, and the person who is elected there wins the most votes. So it's a fairly straightforward system. Voters cast a ballot, they vote for one candidate, and whoever gets the most votes wins that district. And then the party that wins the government in Ottawa is the party that elects, usually, the party that elects the most members to parliament. And if the party gets a majority, then they govern as a majority government. If they get less than 50% of the seats in the House of Commons, they may govern as a minority government, which is Justin Trudeau's Liberals are right now. They're a minority government because they have fewer than 50% of the seats in the House of Commons.
And what is the argument for keeping the first past the post
system? Well, there are many arguments,
and what is the argument for changing it?
System you are thinking about changing it to. So there are different types of electoral systems, and many people who support the first past the post system that we have in Canada argue that it's a straightforward system. It's relatively easy for people to understand. It's important that people understand how the system works because that helps ensure that people have confidence in the system. They know how votes are counted and they know who their elected representative is. It's the person who wins the most votes in their district. And so people support the system for those reasons. Now, people who argue for proportional representation, and again, there are different types of systems that can provide proportional representation. Usually people argue in favor of ensuring that the House of Commons looks like the population of Canada. So proportional representation systems do a better job of ensuring that parties that get a certain percentage of the vote get that same percentage of the seats in the House of Commons.
If the motion in the House was to carry, what would a National Citizens Assembly look like?
So the Citizens Assemblies are
a
very interesting democratic institution that it was actually developed in British Columbia in 2004. There was a provincial Citizens Assembly that studied the provincial electoral system in British Columbia. And this institution has since been replicated in Ontario, for example, but has been used actually all over the world. And British Columbia then is recognized as a leader in this democratic innovation. And what the Citizens Assembly is a group of people who function a little like the legislature or the House of Commons. But instead of being elected to their position, they're randomly selected. That is, we send out letters to people and invite them to put their name forward to participate in the Citizens Assembly. And from amongst those who put their names forward, a certain number of people are randomly selected. And what this does is produce an assembly that is broadly representative of the population. So it should have about 50% men and women. It should have a representation of other groups. And if we're worried about other groups not being represented, you can ensure that certain members of specific groups are represented in this selection process. So what it does is produce a very representative body that then can make judgments about particular public policies, or in this case, electoral system design, and they can do so in an informed, deliberative way. They're given the time to study the issue. They consult with citizens, but they also consult with experts, and they deliberate the issue amongst themselves so that they can hear different viewpoints and take into consideration a whole range of different ideas and arguments and concerns and benefits, and deliberate all of those ideas and then make a recommendation. So they could recommend, in this case, to not change the electoral system, or they could recommend to change it. And if they recommend to change it, they might then recommend a specific system that they think would be best.
What could be some of the possible options on the table for a more proportional electoral system?
There are many options, and not all of them are proportional. So sometimes people propose a ranked ballot system where people would rank order the candidates that they want. So they would look at the names on the ballot and they would say, well, I'd like to rank this person 1, this person 2, and this person 3. And there are different ways of counting ranked order ballots, and some are proportional systems and others are not. So this is one style of reform that people have suggested in the past. And indeed, some jurisdictions in Canada at the municipal level have introduced preferential systems. So that's one possibility. Proportional representation systems come in many different forms. So the one that they use in Ireland does use ranked ballots, but it produces proportionality. That is, the percentage of the votes broadly equals the percentage of seats that parties receive in the legislature. Other proportional systems are what are called list proportional systems. And so the parties would produce then a list of candidates that they would like elected, and voters would vote for the party list as opposed to the individual candidate. Now, in a country like Canada, it wouldn't just be one big constituency. We would have provincial areas and also smaller geographic constituencies within those provinces. But they would be bigger constituencies than we currently have, because each constituency would then have more than one representative. And so you might have in a constituency Liberal representatives, you might have a few NDP representatives, a Green representative. It just really depends on how many people are in each constituency. And so the proportional system on that model would produce a more proportional result. That is, if you voted for a small party like the Greens in your area, you may very well get a Green representative, even if that person doesn't win, or if that party rather doesn't win the most votes in your constituency.
So looking at other countries that have a proportional electoral system, how would it change the way that Canadians
vote and also the results of the vote? And everything is in the details with electoral system design. It really depends on how the system is designed, and that will affect both the experience of voting and who's elected, and thus who forms the government in Ottawa. So it's very hard to say how it would affect the experience of voting, the choices that Canadians have, and the results of the election without knowing what the design of the specific system would be. Nevertheless, if Canada were to adopt a proportional representation system, there is good evidence from studies in other countries that proportional representation usually produces more parties. So we have two major parties in Canada that are regularly elected to government. We have the regional Bloc Québécois, we have the Green Party, we have other parties that have emerged and disappeared over time. But primarily we have the two main parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, that form government in Canada at the federal level. And if we had a proportional representation system, the probability is that there would be more parties to choose from, and there would be more parties represented in the House of Commons. Now, you can't say in advance what the strength of any one of those parties is going to be, and because this is a democracy, the strength of the parties changes and ought to change over time. But you can say that there's likely to be more parties and thus more choice for voters, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. And there would be fewer majority governments. If there's more parties in the House of Commons, then there are going to be fewer majority governments. That is, it's less likely that any one party will have more than 50% of the seats in the House of Commons. Great, thanks very much.
Thank you so much for joining me on Midcoast Morning. That was BIU Political Studies professor Michael McKenzie. Next, I speak with Gisela Ruckert from Fair Vote Canada about electoral reform and why they believe there's a need for change. To start us off, can you explain what Fair Vote Canada is and what you do there?
So Fair Vote Canada is a national movement. It's an organization, a not-for-profit, with the goal of reforming Canada's electoral systems. So we currently have a system called First Past the Post, which is, becoming an anachronism around the world. Hardly any modern democracies use it anymore. And Fair Vote Canada's goal is to change that system, to reform it to one that better reflects the preferences of voters so that we get what we voted for. My role is, I became involved as a volunteer, probably about 10 years ago. And since then, I was elected to the national board, and I've been a board member for, 5 years now.
Can you explain to listeners the difference between our current pass-the-post system and more proportional electoral systems? Why is there a need for a change to our voting system?
It's clear that we do need to change our voting system because we have a system that distorts voters' preferences. It's called First Past the Post. It's a relic from the colonial era. The only countries still using it are basically ones that, like we did, inherited it from our British masters and are still stuck with it. So the reason that it needs to be reformed is because it doesn't actually give a fair reflection of what voters voted for, because it was designed for two parties. So as soon as you get more than two parties, the results get distorted. And Canada hasn't had two parties in our parliament since, 1921, something like that. Anyways, over 100 years. So what we get under first past the post are false majorities. So, for example, both Justin Trudeau in 2015 and Stephen Harper before him won, I'm putting air quotes here around the term majority governments, with 39% of the vote, which doesn't make any sense when you think about what a majority ought to be. And under a proportional system, which is the most common type of electoral system used around the world, that 39% of the vote would have gotten each of them 39% of the seats. So under a proportional system, every party, every interest group is rewarded by the number of seats that corresponds to their share of the vote. And since parties generally don't have more than 50% voter support, what that means is you have parties working together. They have to collaborate, and they end up looking for common ground instead of attacking each other constantly, which is what we see now.
And are there any countries similar to Canada that have made this change?
New Zealand is probably the most obvious one. New Zealand adopted proportional representation in the late 1990s. I think the first election held under it was 1996, and they're very similar to us culturally. They're also, a former British colony, and they made the change. And they actually have chosen to stick with it since then. There was some movement by some vested interests, former and existing politicians who liked the old way better because it gave them more power, and they actually voted to keep it. So it's solidly established there, and I think it sets a really good model for Canada in terms of how it could work here as well.
In a 2022 ECOS poll, it reported that 76% of Canadians supported a National Citizens' Assembly on electoral reform. With numbers like that, why not just advocate for a referendum before an assembly?
Oh, you brought up one of my favorite topics. I think in BC, we've seen what happens with referendums. We had the latest one actually on electoral reform in 2018, and it didn't go well. The reason is because people support change, but they always get lost in the weeds of what the specific system design ought to be. And there are also people who are really opposed to electoral reform who tend to put out arguments that are not based in fact, but that do sway emotional responses. And that's exactly what we saw in BC. If you look at the surveys that came out after the BC referendum in 2018, it says that a majority of British Columbians were confused with the options offered. Almost half of them felt uninformed. And then they list some reasons why they voted no. And most of them are actually factually inaccurate. So we've seen that voters are very vulnerable to unethical opponents of reform who just simply put out misinformation. And that is typical for referendums. Referendums are also making a really big ask of citizens. It's not like, do you want red or blue? Electoral systems are complex, and you need to have a fairly high level of information in order to be able to make a good decision. And, most people right after the BC referendum, the survey shows that they just didn't feel like they were really solid in what they were being asked to decide between.
And if somebody wanted to get involved with reform, what could they do?
Well, I think that getting involved with this motion and building support for it is a really good place to start. There's a website called nationalcitizensassembly.ca that gives people more information on what this motion before us that will be going to Parliament, to a vote in Parliament in this term, is about. So I would just recommend that people talk to their MPs and encourage them to support this motion, because it's clear that strong democratic institutions are key to a functional government, and Canada is not immune to the problems of democratic decline that we're already witnessing in other places. So it's a matter of time, I think, and we need to strengthen our system before it gets any worse. So if people want to get involved, check out nationalcitizensassembly.ca or look for us online, fairvote.ca. That's the Fair Vote Canada website, which is another great place for information on why electoral reform is needed and what the options are as well.
Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity.
That was our story for the day. Thank you to MP Lisa Marie Barron, Michael McKenzie, and Gisela Ruckert for joining me today. I'm Laura McKenzie, host and producer of Mid-Coast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHY's newsletter at chy.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom and more. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. You can find more of their music on their Bandcamp. Support local artists by buying their music. If you have a story you would like us to cover, email us at news@choi.ca.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHOI's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at choi.ca/donate. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.